it's really quite a pleasure to welcome Peter Carey back to P&P. He's been here several times before for some of his works, and it's always a treat hosting this two-time Booker Prize winner. Although he's resided for nearly 30 years now in New York, where he teaches creative writing at Hunter College, Peter is frequently described as the greatest living Australian-born writer. So how's that for setting the bar pretty high? That's right. Okay. We won't tell him that I said it. In his new book, A Long Way from Home, his 14th novel, Peter returns to an Australian setting. The period is the 1950s, and the focus, at least in the first part of the book, is a car race, specifically the Redex Reliability Trial, which was an actual event back then. Drivers had to cover 10,000 miles around Australia in 17 days, sustaining a certain average speed between stops. There's an autobiographical element for Peter in this. His parents owned a GM dealership in the small town of Bacchus Marsh in Victoria, where the book begins. And as a boy, Peter followed the race. His appreciation for both the landscape and the engineering comes through in the novel. But as it unfolds, the book becomes something other than a road trial and ends up addressing Australia's brutal history of racism. Previously in his writings, Peter hadn't directly confronted the tragic treatment of the indigenous people. He told one newspaper that he'd always felt it wasn't the place of a white writer to tell this tale. But then something changed, and as he said in the newspaper interview, quote, "You can't be a white Australian writer and spend your whole life ignoring the greatest, most important aspect of our history, and that is that I, have been the beneficiaries of a genocide." Peter will be in conversation this evening with Elliot Ackerman, a young writer who's been making a name for himself as the author so far of two well-received war novels, Green on Blue and Dark at the Crossing. Elliot spoke about both novels here at P&P, and will be appearing here again next Tuesday for the paperback edition of Dark at the Crossing, in tandem with an Egyptian-born Canadian journalist, Omar El-Akkad, in his debut novel, American War. So please join me in welcoming Peter Carey and Elliot Ackerman.
Great to be here in windy Washington, D.C. So anyways, I really enjoyed the book, Peter. I thought we'd start, can you talk a little more about the Redex? Because I think it was kind of, for me, it was a really interesting point of departure for the novel. And, and how long had you been kind of mulling over that as a starting point for a story?
I wasn't really mulling over the Redex, although I'll answer the question in a second.
Sure.
But yeah, the thing that's always hanging in there is the big story of Australia, which the land stolen, the people were murdered. We are the beneficiaries of that. And it's not like I woke up one morning at the age of 65 or 70 and realised that. I've known that for many, many years, but there's whole sorts of questions like, can you write this? Should you write it? And ultimately, how in the hell would you write it? So that's always, it's been there for a long, long time. The Redex Trial.
Yeah.
I grew up in a car business. All my family talked about every night and every morning were cars, often deals. My grandfather had been an aviator, like a rather unpleasant character in the book. He was not unpleasant, but the character in the book is. So cars went right through the family. In the 50s, when Redex was a motor oil additive, as I recall. So, and I think made in the UK, and this is meant to be a sort of a promotional thing for this product. But let me tell you, after the whole thing, this great successful promotion had finished, no one in Australia knew what Redex was. So, but, so you've got to think, it's the 50s, it's after the war. People like to talk about it as an innocent time, but I really don't see how Australia was ever innocent any more than the United States has ever been innocent, although it loses its innocence continually, I read in the papers. So the big brands, if you like, they're all the brands you might expect, Chrysler and Plymouth and blah, blah. But there were two particular. Ford was in Australia, and General Motors had played a really amazing sort of trick where they re-engineered a German Opel, called it a Holden, and promoted it as Australia's own car.
Right.
And they plant in South Australia. They had it financed by the Australian government, and all the profits were repatriated to the United States. But that was Australia's own car, and we believed it. So part of all the thing that's going when the Redex Trial comes along is that. But the country, the people in the country were just sort of intoxicated with the notion of this car race. And it's impossible to conceive now. I mean, if you were in Melbourne in the football season, you would understand how the whole town goes insane. And if the world ended, it wouldn't matter if Geelong were playing Collingwood. And the Redex Trial became like that. People were rather competitive. Sometimes they came to fisticuffs.
Right.
And the trial, when it started, I think had 280 contenders. And it was front page of the newspapers.
How many would usually finish?
How many? Well, there were only about 3 Redex trials, I think.
Right.
I don't know. You should know that.
I don't know. Would you maybe read just a little bit from the
sure.
front of the book?
Okay, sure.
You can use mine.
There's 2 voices in the book. I always think, I don't know what you think when you do a reading. I always think that the minute you do a reading, you're sort of destroying your book in a way, because you're persuading your audience that is how it should be read and that's how it should sound. Where in fact, I believe it's what happens in the reader's head that really makes the voices. And this is particularly apparent in this case because the 2 narrators, the first one's a woman. So I'm creating an obstacle for myself by reading it to you, but never mind. This is the opening of the book. For a girl to defeat one father is a challenge. But there were 2 standing between me and what I wanted, which was not to fiddle-faddle, a lovely little fellow named Peter Bobs. The first father was my own. When he discovered that I, his teeny Irene, his little mouse, his petite-sized mademoiselle, had all by herself proposed matrimony to a man of 5'3", he spat his Wheaties in his plate. Titch's father was number 2. He came out of the gate at a gallop, 100% in my favour. I was a beauty, a Bobby Dazzler, until in the hallway by the coat stand, he gave me cause to slap his face. My sister was older and, as they say, more experienced. She couldn't see why I would want so small a husband. Did I plan to breed a team of mice? Ha, bloody ha. Beverly was 5'2.5", and had already always breaking off engagements to Lanky Lurch or Gigantic Dino or that famous football player whose name I am not ignorant enough to mention. I would have been afraid to shake his hand, forget the other business. Beverly made her bed and got what you might expect, i.e., 30-hour labours and heads as big as pumpkins. My own children were as tiny and perfect as their daddy, ideal in their proportions, in the lovely coordination of their limbs and the pink, aptly cheeks they inherited from Titch, the smile they got from me. My sister could not abide my happiness. She would spend years looking for evidence that it was fake. When her first husband ran away to New Zealand, she wrote me a spiteful letter saying I must be more interested in my husband than in my kiddies. She said her boys were everything to her. She knew, she wrote, I only married Titch because of the money I could get from him. She was upset, of course. Why wouldn't she be? She married a bastard. She was divorced, she said, without a penny. So could she please go and live in in the childhood home we had both inherited and whose sale she had always managed to impede. Could Titch and I have used the money? She didn't ask. Would it have changed our lives? Of course. I agreed on a peppercorn rent and kept my feelings to myself. Well, Beverly used to say that I was willful, which was an idea she got from Mum. But Mum liked me being willful. She got a real kick from seeing how I got my way. Of course, she was a bit the same, Mum. And she was blessed with such neat, level teeth and cheekbones, you would do anything to see her smile, even if you had to buy her a washing machine to make her do it. She got Dad to purchase the Ford, which was what brought Titch to our door in Geelong, Victoria, Australia. It was Victory in Europe Day, May the 8th, 1945. No one will ever know how Mum planned to utilise the Ford, drive down to Colac and see her sister after church. That was one story not even Dad could swallow. Didn't matter. He went on and wrote the cheque to the salesman, Dan Bobst, who, as I discovered when I opened the door on VE Day, had thrown in free driving lessons which would be supplied by his sonny. Oh Lord, what a sight that sonny was, there on our front porch with his cardboard suitcase on a Tuesday morning. I learned he was to stay with us. Poor Mum, alas, she never got to put the key in the ignition. And everyone was so upset, busy with the funeral. No one told the young man that he should leave. He had nowhere else to stay, so he unpacked his case and awaited instructions, as he later liked to say. The Ford was parked in our drive with no sign that it was now part of the deceased estate. My mum was in the Mount Duneed Cemetery, and the new boarder was the only one who helped me go through her things. He said nothing about the car or about the lessons he had been expecting to give the deceased. He asked me if I knew how to drive. I told him that if he could be home by 6 at night, he could have tea with us. In the midst of all the sadness, the pretty red-cheeked man was a great comfort. I could not do without. I held my breath. I cooked for him. He scraped his plate clean and helped with the drying up. He was neat. When I cried, he comforted me. He left talcum powder on the bathroom floor. In the nights at Western Beach, when you could hear the forlorn anchor chains of the old warship ships anchored in Corio Bay, he told me stories of his father, which he thought were funny. These were more important than I knew. In any case, my eyes stung hot to hear that lovely boy had broken his arm swinging the propeller of the wretched father's monoplane, and that the old bully had taught him to land by sitting behind him in the navigator's seat, thumping his slender back with his fist until he pushed the stick down sufficiently, and that he had abandoned him to stay with a pair of old Irish bachelors at Wollongorok until they had learned to drive their Ford. The sonny was named Titch, although he was sometimes Zack, which was what they used to call a sixpence, and Zack was therefore half a shilling, or, as they said, half a bob, which was, of course, his father's name, but forget it. He was always Titch, God Jesus, and it seemed I was put on earth to love your tortured body and your impy, joyous soul. How could I predict, dear Beverly, what sort of life my heart's desire would lead me to? Our dad was still alive on the day I first set eyes on Titch. My babies were not yet born. I couldn't drive a car. We had not yet arrived at the era of Holden versus Ford, which was not, there was not even a Redex around Australia reliability trial, although that, the greatest Australian car race of the century, is a story I will get to in the end. So they're the car business. I mean, they're the people with the car business who go into the Redex trial, this husband and wife team. And Irene, unlike me, and unlike my own mother, fabulous driver.
I mean, and a pretty fabulous woman. I mean, one of the central things in the book is sort of the relationship between Irene and Titch, which, not to reveal too much, sort of starts in one place and kind of seems to descend throughout the novel. Reading the book, I couldn't help but notice how much there were these, how significant the intergenerational relationships were, whether it's between Irene and Titch, or Titch and his father. And, I was just wondering if you would talk about that in the context of, the country, because it's a book about the country.
Yeah, I think there are things that happen when you write that you weren't really thinking about when you were doing it. And so patterns end up emerging. And they're there in this book. And what you're talking about is true. It is a thing. It's a thing about fathers and sons, particularly. It keeps on. But was I thinking, I've got to write a story about fathers and sons? It's just the way it sort of emerged. Yep. A lot of things that I'm sitting there plotting and planning all day long, but not that.
But did you feel in retrospect, would it be fair to say when you got to the end of this, because it's a book about the country and where people's lineage comes from, that is sort of what inevitably starts to come out in a more personal way?
I don't know. I think sometimes some of the best things one does, one didn't mean to do.
Sure.
Or didn't know one was doing. And that's got to happen.
Right.
Sometimes if you think of all the sort of vectors of force, threads of story, really, maybe it's not an exaggeration to say, certainly it's not an exaggeration to say thousands that make up a novel, then in the end there'll be some that I don't know.
Right. Will you talk about, because we hit two with important characters, but would you talk about William Bachuber? Or if I'm screwing up his name, tell me.
Well, this is very interesting. It's quite a thrill, actually, to be going everywhere and people say, how do I pronounce my character's name? And you see, I've never heard anybody say that name. So every time you say it, I think, oh my God, that's how you say it. So,
it might not be how you say it.
Well, I say Bachuber, but it's probably, it's maybe, but it's Australia, so we say all sorts of things in weird ways. So maybe I'll just say it's Bachuber and that's correct. Well, there's a difficult thing about this book, and the book's got a big secret. And the secret is part of the whole generation of the book and the planning of the book. And then the thing when we have a discussion like this is, how can we talk about it without revealing the secret? And if you reveal the secret, does it screw up your experience? Mm-hmm. Willie is there. Willie's the carrier of a secret. And he was going to be the person. Well, Willie's a very amiable, I think, a little melancholic, actually, perhaps. Somebody who has very unsuccessful or poor sort of track record in his relationship with women, where he mostly seems to get things wrong. And Willie's the one who's always going to be hurt. I wanted a lot of things from him. I wanted him to be very well informed, because you can't rely on Titch and Irene to have any reasonable education about anything too much. So I needed somebody who did. I made Willie a school teacher.
And a quiz show champion.
But I didn't want him to be rich. So these sorts of problems, add to sort of complexity in the story, and that's sort of. So I think, how can he be a quiz show champion and not have really any money? Well, it's because the quiz show is being funded by a number of very low advertising rates for clients who really don't have any money to give big prizes for. But the guy who runs the quiz show's idea is that he'll tell everyone that the prizes are big. The show will be successful, and in the end he will get a big national advertising client who will underwrite the prizes. But in the meantime, Willie is presented with those huge checks you're photographed with, which are worth nothing. And he's just hoping the day will come when the checks are worth something. So he doesn't have any money. He's not actually a trained teacher, but in this job at Bacchus Marsh, he proves to have been very good with the troublesome, I think it's the second form. And these are kids, mostly boys out of control. And he's been good at it.
Not to give anything away, he dangles one out of a window, correct?
That's where he was less good.
Okay.
And that's the turning point, really, for Willie, because he just sort of loses it. And he hangs his kid out of the second floor window of the Bacchus Marsh High School. complicated thing. For that to really work, I had to build another story on the back of Smash High School, but that's neither here nor there, really. And so he gets into trouble. Finally, he loses his job. And so just as Titch and Irene are ready to go on this sort of reckless, wild challenge, Willie's there. And Willie's the other thing I gave. He's got a passion for maps, a great interest in maps, can read maps. Irene's a great driver, but she's a really terrible navigator. And there's Willie and maps. And so Titch, visiting him and realising that and seeing his maps, sends him to the bathroom to weigh himself with his clothes off. Because how much will he weigh? How much gas will he use if he's the third person? And because the two of them are quite light, Willie's not heavy, and at that stage he can't even drive. So he's going to be the navigator.
One of the things in the book, and I thought maybe you could talk about it, is, Willie is sort of this keeper of the knowledge. I mean, not only his encyclopedic quiz show knowledge, but all sorts of different types of knowledge. And we start to see how that knowledge becomes subjective, and how even his passion for geography starts to become subjective at certain points. And could you just talk about, like, the subjectivity seems to be a theme in the book?
My life.
All right,
well, I'm not quite. One of the things about what we can call subjective is Willie's convinced. He's got a German name. His father is a Lutheran pastor in Adelaide. His mother is a German Lutheran woman. His whole sense of himself in Australia, which is, I think, not an unusual thing for Australians to feel, is that he's really not from there. Willie really believes he's from somewhere else. In fact, he is from somewhere else, but not the somewhere else that he thinks. And
why'd you make him German?
Well, there's a whole. If you look at Australian missions, Australian pastor, you think of the relationships between various missions. The Lutherans were there, so there were many missionary. So, and this is to give away something, but I have to do it. But it's quite reasonable that Lutherans would adopt children,
right?
And that Willie would be one of those adopted children,
right?
I nearly did it.
Well, not too much. Would you like to? We had another section that you were going to read.
Yeah. One of the things about. Thank you very much. One of these things is a really sort of. Australians really, in my experience, generally thought history started last year or 10 years ago, and although Australians really think, yes, of course, there were Aboriginals, we should put them on stamps. We really had no sort of memory and no historical grasp of the fact that we were living in a place that for 40,000 years had been built from a very, very stable culture. And even though there was evidence everywhere for us to know that, and it was certainly never really impinged on me, this child. So this lack of memory and lack of knowledge and hostility to knowledge even is something there's a little scene. It's very, very short. And it's Titch is always saying, don't tell me about the past. When did this happen? 100 years ago? I couldn't care about this. I just got to get on with this race. They're on their way. They've left Brisbane, which is the last big city. And the country's getting rougher. And Irene needs to have a pee. So they stop the car. She takes the little trowel that they all carry for going to the bathroom at the bush, and sets off to find somewhere. Walking up the side of a creek, away from the road, and she realises she doesn't need to dig any holes or do anything because there a huge tree has just fallen during the wet season and fallen into the creek, and it's revealed a great crater where its roots have been. And this is sort of what happens. On the crater walls, only a foot from the surface, I saw the roots had grown around dead bones. The first crumbled in my hands, and I saw there were so many others. A graveyard, sickening. That is, these were not animals. There were so many, they must be blacks. I extracted a human jawbone. I retreated, I rushed back into my overalls. I was an interfering woman. I climbed down into the excavation where I was able to lift a human skull from the broken soil. It was just a tiny thing, as fragile and powdery as an emu egg. I was a mother. I knew what it was to hold a tender child, and I knew this must be a little boy, and all these bones around him must be his family. He was quite clean and very light, and it seemed he might turn to dust if I was clumsy. So I tucked the digging tool in my back pocket and held him in both hands and then carried him as carefully as he were a bowl of water back through the dull shrubs and grasses. So, this is something substantial. Titch's response to this is not what you might hope, in that really he's got a race to win and he doesn't get delayed by anything. And Irene wants to go to the Townsville police station to report this, which is touching in a way and stupid in another, and anybody who knows anything about Aboriginal culture knows that way of dealing with human remains is really something you really, really don't do. You don't remains of people's relations and carry them around in your car, but she doesn't know that. When they get to Townsville, she's rather surprised that although she's told the policeman nothing, the policeman knows exactly where she found it, the area she found it. And one of the things that I think Australians are more and more aware of is the incidence of massacres right through the country in places that they never ever imagined. Massacres maybe happen a long way away in the Northern Territory or in Western Australia, but many, many, many sites of massacres are more revealed all the time. So this is a significant part of the story, and but we're still not telling you. You see, what's really we haven't really broken the surprise, have we?
I don't think so.
That's a very good surprise.
You mentioned before that this was something you hadn't felt like, meaning Australia's history. That what sort of why now in your career?
Any book I ever wrote involving Australia, it's something that really has to be acknowledged. So I always acknowledged it. You can't. And so in books as early as Illiwacker and Oscar and Lucinda is really about the destruction of Aboriginal culture. But people don't read it and think, oh, this is a book about the destruction of Aboriginal culture, even though it is. And then there was an occasion in about 1980, about the time I was writing Oscar and Lucinda, that I went to a Canberra Playwrights Conference, and there was an Aboriginal activist called Gary Foley, who was not a gentleman. And he addressed the audience of mostly white, mostly male playwrights. And he said, I know you guys really want to help. And I know you really want to write about us and and do good things, but if you do me just as a personal favour, I'd like to ask you not to do that. Because we've got to live with enough bullshit anyway. We've got enough things to deal with, and we really don't need you inventing more things that are wrong or misimagined. So how about you just don't do it? And I thought that was really reasonable. I felt no resistance to that at all, and I thought that's right. And I sort of took it to heart. And so depending on what I was doing, that was in my mind. And I got to a certain stage, time goes on. 70, 74 now, but when I'm 70, start to think, 70 years old, you've written about Australia all your life, and you've never once directly dealt with the most important thing about your country, which is murder, dispossession, destruction of land and culture. You've never done that, so what sort of Australian writer could you be? So I'm well, aware as I was. I mean, I suppose what Gary Foley was talking about was appropriation in a way. But we weren't using that word back then. And so I'm thinking all this in the age when we discuss the ethics of appropriation. And I thought a number of quite different things about it. I thought I agree with Gary Foley. If your life, your culture, your family has been murdered, dispossessed, and everything that your ancestors held dear has been destroyed, why would you want the same people to come in and imagine your intimate life? And why would you trust them? Or why would you? So I think that's one part of the dynamic of this. But the other thing, which I believe equally, is that if you're a writer, your whole job on earth is to imagine what it is to be other people. It's advice that works for people other than writers. I sometimes think our president might like to think of that, but I guess he isn't going to. But still, the business of imagining what it is to be someone else. People who don't write sometimes find it hard to believe that people who do what we do can make stuff up and that it can be authentic and real, because it seems impossible. They think that it has to have happened to you before you can write about it. I know that's not true. So I thought I have to do this. I thought it was, at the time, actually now I don't think it was a dangerous thing to do at all, but at the time I thought it was.
The time being?
The time when I was setting
starting this book.
I am going to write this book, no matter what. Mm-hmm. And I can make a dick of myself, and I can be vilified. But at least I should really, to be honourable, I should try. And then when it was all over, I thought the thing that I'd done that makes this book work is because of the time I spent with indigenous people, and read also as well, because reading, although my family would think reading wasn't a very important thing, I think we realise reading is a pretty important thing. And I spent a lot of time with indigenous people, with anthropologists, and I made things up freely. And when I'd finished the book, or when I was near the end, there's patches of dialogue which weren't written by me. It wasn't going to be my voice impersonating an indigenous voice because I couldn't do it. So that was a rather thrilling piece of collaboration. And there's also a certain collagist element in the book, in that one of the wonderful things Aboriginal people have done, which white people didn't know at all, is they've appropriated white culture and turned it back against white culture. And there's glorious instances of a Noah's Ark and a Captain Cook saga, which flip things around very beautifully. And one of those about Captain Cook, not my words, but the words of the man who told the story. I got lost now. Where was I going?
Appropriation and Aboriginal cultures flipping it back on white culture.
Yeah. And the Captain Cook story, which I commend to you. I forgot it.
Can I see that?
Yeah.
I just wanted to, and then maybe.
Don't read it out.
Well, I'm not going to read it out, but
I can't read it out.
I wanted to read this last piece because it really moved me. It was you say, what seems to be the signs of madness might be understood by someone familiar with alchemical literature as an encryption whose function is to insist that our mother country is a foreign land whose language we have not yet earned the right to speak. That's a great line. Yeah.
But I've since wondered about how you read that line outside of Australia.
Well, but that's why I read it here.
because the business really, like Aboriginal culture, is the land. Mm-hmm. And the one thing even the most conservative Australians would allow us as indigenous people is their country.
Right.
And we that we're going to die. And
Right.
and the person who's writing this has found himself being the guardian, and this has sometimes happened, the guardian of indigenous ceremonial religious secrets, because there's no one else there to collect it.
Yeah.
And he can't. It's very serious business. I mean, there's secrets there that if you tell someone, and the person who's collecting these secrets is keeping them.
Mm-hmm.
With excitement, it's getting them, but he can't share them.
Right.
And that's also part of this, and also that we, writers, can't possibly read. We don't know where we are. Is that what it feels like? So,
That is well, and I think it's very. I mean, I want to get to this, but I think it's very much. I'd be interested in knowing how you felt writing that in America, because there are obvious similarities with America.
I wasn't.
America, I know, but I, as an American, I'm reading this and I'm thinking about living as an American.
Yeah, well, that's what one, of course, when one writes.
Of course.
It's what one desires most of all, that things be. When I grew up in Australia, we were sort of a self-hating, post-colonial society. We never thought we had very much worth ourselves. We always automatically looked elsewhere for culture. We had no trouble at all in being interested in the culture of France or Italy or Europe particularly. And that's sort of how we grew up reading. We were so different, and I'm going to talk about America now. We're so different to how I think of the general drift of American reading, which is often to have very little curiosity about out there, because this is a dominant culture, and the dominant culture really has to worry primarily about itself. And it's not like we self-hating Australians who desperately had to know about other things. And so the result for that's sort of quite good, that we had some curiosity. But I don't think that's here, so I don't necessarily expect the New York Times to notice that.
Right.
How that might apply to.
Fair enough.
And I have some bitter thoughts on that subject, but I won't.
We have any questions?
Yeah. Is Aboriginal culture homogenous within itself, or like Native American culture, highly complex, made up of many, many different ethnic and cultural heritages, groups, if you will, lineages?
Well, I'm not an anthropologist, so I'm not. If you look, there's a wonderful map of Australia. Like all maps that are redrawn with a different light, they're always fascinating to me anyway. And it's like a patchwork quilt version of Australia. These are all Aboriginal language groups. So there's that. I think there's also an enormous commonality, but I don't feel safe saying that, because it's not my job in writing this book to have broad anthropological knowledge of all Aboriginal cultures. I mean, when you write a novel, you have to know enough to make your book work in the corners that it goes into, and to make them authentic. But I think there's a lot of commonality. There's certainly a lot of difference. There's enormous variation, but it feels to me like more variation on a theme. If that makes any sense.
So, Peter, you've already been to Australia to talk about this book, and I read one newspaper review that was very positive. I mean, how has it been received generally?
I often have learned to go home to Australia expecting a damn good whacking, which I felt, I anticipated in the book before this one, Amnesia, and I certainly thought I would get it with this one, because all my friends, when I told them what I was to my Australian friends, shook their heads and looked very solemn at me. It was really well received. The very first night in Sydney, I did an event with an amazingly smart Aboriginal man, the sort of person you think should be Prime Minister, and may well be a man called Stan Grant. He was a journalist, he was a And although I knew he said he liked the book, I was sort of apprehensive about standing on a stage with him because I thought he was going to do something to me. But it was sort of a love fest. And I thought afterwards, whatever happens with this book, it'll never ever be quite as good as this night when Stan Grant loved the book. So it was successful, and a lot of the hoary old racists who you expect to come out and slander you actually didn't. But maybe they're taking their time, and they will arrive, I'm sure. I mean, in a minute you talk about these massacres. There's plenty of people who will come out and say they never happened. That's that sort of thing. Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if the fact that you live in New York has affected how you either think or write about Australia over time.
Well, inevitably, it looks stranger. But everybody looks stranger. You guys look stranger too. And like, arriving to live in New York, it seemed very familiar. Everyone, it was like the books I've read, and the music I've listened to, and movies I've seen, and it felt like I was in a really, really familiar place. And yet with time, you start to realize this familiar thing is really, really weird. So that's rewarding, I think, that sort of dislocation and strangeness. And with Australia, I suppose it's true. I've certainly found ways to, for instance, when I have to tell a New York friend about Australia, and I say, well, the song of our heart in Australia is Waltzing Matilda, and Waltzing Matilda is really a song about a homeless man who stole a sheep, was caught by the police, and committed suicide rather than go into custody. That's the song of our heart. I mean, that is the song that moves us. So maybe the distance of being away, you see the total strangeness. I mean, this is not the Star-Spangled Banner by any means. So these sort of differences and the strangeness of the different cultures is rewarding. I'd like to think I would have done it the same anyway. But that is to wish on myself to be something that I would be someone who's unchanged by life. So I think I better take the option that being here has changed me.
For whatever it's worth, Yankee Doodle Dandy still makes absolutely no sense to me.
Two of the books I always tell my students to read are Bruce Chatwin's Songlines and also Robert Hughes's The Fatal Shore. I mean, if you want to know Australia to the degree that you can, if you're not going to go there, we've been there many times, that's a really good basis to work from.
Oh, Robert Hughes was a good friend of mine. A good friend of Bob's. That's a complicated thing anyway. But he's a great man, a great writer. And actually, when I was coming away, my wife was in New York is English. And she said, I really want something wonderful to read while I'm away. I said, read The Fatal Shore. It is such a great book. So I agree with you about that. And we were so pissed with Chatwin. An Englishman is going to come out and stay in a trailer, which he rarely left, as I understand it, and write this important book, which affects... Huh? It was really, really important. I think we should have all been ashamed, that he was the one that told us what was there, and we didn't really. We generally, the anthropologists, but the rest of us didn't really know it, and Chatwin told us. So, yeah.
I think we got time for one more. Two more if it's a two-part.
I was going to say, could I ask two quick questions? So the first one is, could you describe your professional journey becoming a writer? What were some of the challenges you faced? What did your family think of your choices? How did you get it? And the second one is, Who are your most influential authors? And if you had to narrow it down to one you're going to take with you to a desert island, who would the author be? And
Well, it's different to influence. But I think, the person who comes to mind immediately who can withstand that sort of reading and who I just admire is W.G. Siebold. And a book like Austerlitz would not wear out quickly. But he came along too late and died too young. He didn't influence me. He's influenced a lot of people. I could name the books right now. You can find Siebold in the syntax, particularly of English writers, but some American writers, where the influence is like they're 18, and they're not 18, the writers that have been influenced by him. He said, like all influences, he's a very, very dangerous man. It's like being influenced by Samuel Beckett or something. It's not going to take you anywhere new. Samuel Beckett's a great writer. So there's that. It never occurred to me I might be a writer. I thought I was going to be an organic chemist. I loved the periodic table. The lovely thing about the periodic table is that it's like maps in a sense, that the structure of things predicts the behavior of the element, and it's a beautiful thing for writers. Can sometimes think like that, and it's always sort of in my mind. But I was a total failure. I discovered many things in my first year at university which were generally positive, but none of them led to success in science. And I got a job in an advertising agency, and for no reason other than my then girlfriend's brother worked in an advertising agency, and I found it was full of writers. And people were there writing novels, short stories. One had a great rejection letter from Esquire. It was that one of them used to give me his books, which he was given to review, instead of helping to pay for the gas on the way to work. And we knew a copy chief of another advertising agency who'd read Finnegan's Wake. And it was an odd sort of, and I decided very quickly that I was going to be a writer. I'd read just about nothing. I'd been to a good school where I'd read just about nothing. So when I announced that I was going to be a writer, I was saying I'm going to walk out onto the same field as Virginia Woolf and Proust and Joyce and whatever. But anyway, I did. Decided to do that, and I began to write. And I wrote a novel, and I wrote another novel, and I wrote another novel, and by the time I got some praise, got some little bits published, and by the time I got sick of failing at that and started to write short stories, I finally knew enough to be able to write, and I got some things published. So over a period of about 10 years, which seems a reasonable amount of time, I don't know what you think, to teach yourself to be a writer. Sure. Yeah? It's about the right number, isn't it? Or not?
Yeah, 10, yeah.
Who is currently, when you think about Flanagan just having won a couple of years ago, the Booker, Wilde, who's up and coming, who are the Australian writers who are the one that you would select, that you would say, everybody in this audience should be the one?
Frankly, not a one of them.
Pardon?
Not a one of them. Well, who do you know? I always think I always have thought Helen Garner is a wonderful, wonderful writer. Do you know her work? And she's couldn't be a more different writer than the sort of writer I am. She writes very closely to life. She's got an extraordinary visual intelligence. She dissects people. She loses friends continually. There's a wonderful book called The Spare Room, which might. Anyway, it's probably, and it's about a woman who's has serious cancer who comes to stay with a friend, and it's sometimes awfully funny, and very grim, and very tough, and I would recommend that. But it's not. She's not trying to write Finnegan's Wake. She's just writing very beautifully made. So I admire her a lot.
And I think
So,
no. But I think in addition to those books, they can also buy your books. Yeah, as we wrap up, I'll say. Anyways, thank you all so much.